The very first broadcast of the Voice of America in 1942 was not in English, it was in German. And it was explaining to people in Germany what was happening, the news about the war at that time, with a promise in the initial broadcast: the news may be good, the news may be bad, we will tell you the truth.
I'm Mashi Udensiva-Brenner, and you're listening to Beyond the Scoop, a podcast from Harriman Magazine at Columbia University's Harriman Institute. That was Jeff Trimble, one of our authors. Jeff is a journalist and former U.S. international broadcasting executive who spoke to me about the history of Voice of America and other U.S. services, and the Trump administration's attempts to close them all down. Jeff has been listening to these American broadcasting services for years, and he's witnessed firsthand how they impact people living in repressive regimes all over the world.
U.S. international broadcasting always emphasized reaching people in the languages that they speak, sitting at their kitchen table, talking with their relatives and friends about what's happening in the world.
U.S. international broadcasting has been around for more than 80 years. Its programs are close to Jeff's heart. After working as a correspondent for U.S. News and World Report in Moscow during the late Soviet era, he held executive positions at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, including Director of Broadcasting and Acting President. Then he served in various capacities, most recently as Deputy Director at the U.S. Broadcasting Board of Governors, currently known as the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Now, Jeff is witnessing the Trump administration's efforts to destroy the very services he oversaw for years. I wanted to know his thoughts on what was happening. The first time we spoke was just a few days after President Trump took office. Jeff began by describing the origins of Radio Free Europe, founded in 1950 at the height of the Cold War to cover the former communist bloc in Europe.
The mission of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty during the Cold War was, and the term that's often used is, to be a surrogate, to be a home service broadcaster, giving people of countries where there was not free and independent media domestic news and information primarily that was not available to them because of the nature of their media systems.
Those media systems were heavily censored by the ruling communist parties in Eastern Europe. So the job of the journalists working for Radio Free Europe was to report what was really going on in those countries, telling stories that domestic media could not. The Radio Free Europe journalists did this mainly by interviewing dissidents in the censored regimes, then disseminating the news back to their citizens. Radio Liberty was founded a few years later to do the same kind of reporting for listeners in the Soviet Union. I wondered how these two networks, often abbreviated as RFE-RL, were able to deliver their journalism without being blocked by communist censorship.
So the brilliant technological development dating back to the 1930s that made it possible to reach audiences in these countries was shortwave radio.
Shortwave works by bouncing high-frequency radio waves off the Earth's atmosphere.
It can travel literally all the way around the world. So from shortwave broadcasting stations in Europe, in the United States, and in Asia, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the other international broadcasters were able to put signals into these denied spaces that were available to people if they could get access to shortwave radios.
Jeff says this evolved into a cat and mouse game.
The governments of those countries tried to interfere with those signals through a process known colloquially as jamming, whereby they would broadcast on the same frequency as the shortwave signals, just a noise signal of some kind. Often it sounded like bubbles.
Because jamming would drown out the incoming signal, the international broadcasters had to constantly change the frequencies they were using to transmit their reporting.
So the Soviets in particular were not able to jam all those frequencies, but any particular time you could find the signal someplace if you looked for it that was clear enough. And people who listened in those days used also very creative techniques to pass along the information.
Jeff himself first heard these broadcasts via shortwave radio during the Brezhnev years.
I first listened to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty when I was a student in Moscow.
This was long before Jeff had any inkling that he would lead the organization one day. Back then, he was a Russian language exchange student who found himself in an apartment with a group of refuseniks.
People denied permission to emigrate from the Soviet Union. One of them had been able to get the Radio Liberty signal and record it on a cassette tape recorder, and that cassette was then passed around among friends as kind of a samizdat.
That must have been really cool to witness.
It was exciting, and I should say that while listening to shortwave radio in most of these countries to which Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty broadcast was frowned upon, and as long ago as Stalin's time, you could be punished for listening, and you could be reported for doing so. That tended not to have very significant consequences, particularly later in the Cold War, where the Soviets just ignored it, and it was no longer jammed after 1988.
But in contemporary Russia, history is repeating itself. Under Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin has declared RFE-RL a foreign agent and an undesirable organization. The consequences for those who tune into an undesirable broadcast are potentially quite dire, even worse than they had been during the Cold War, says Jeff.
You can wind up in prison if you merely access and share information that you get from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty through the internet, which is the primary means of delivery today.
U.S. international broadcasting was created as part of a foreign policy effort to fight authoritarianism abroad. Now, with the second Trump administration in power, we're seeing the sort of authoritarian measures the U.S. government used to fight against take hold on our own soil. One of those measures has been an effort to dismantle U.S. international broadcasting. I caught up with Jeff again to discuss. Last time we spoke, the Trump administration had just taken office, and it was still very unclear what the fate of U.S. international broadcasting would be. Can you contextualize briefly what happened next and how the situation has evolved?
On March 15th, included in 7 executive orders issued that particular day, President Trump called for the closure, the cessation of all U.S. international broadcasting.
Employees of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, the same agency Jeff used to be in charge of, received an email with instructions to turn in their badges and return official government property.
Overnight, the dynamic changed from, I think we might be able to fix this thing, to shut it all down. And the Voice of America instantly was taken off the air. People who came to work the next morning found studios closed and locked. Those who came into the building in Washington were told to leave the building.
But while Voice of America was quickly pulled off the air, other government-funded broadcasting agencies managed to operate.
The other broadcasters are private companies that get grants from the parent agency, and they had some money in the bank. So Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, the Middle East broadcasting networks were able to continue their operations, but they also have now had to start to furlough and cut back because despite a number of legal rulings against the administration, funding still has not been provided.
The first Trump administration had a bit of a tumultuous relationship with U.S. international broadcasting. Nothing like this, but could this have been foreshadowed or foreseen in any way?
In the first Trump administration, there was unease and dissatisfaction with U.S. international broadcasting, and particularly the Voice of America, and especially when Mike Pompeo was the Secretary of State. What it comes down to is an attitude in the first Trump administration, and even stronger in the second, that the job of U.S. international broadcasting is to support and promote the policies of the administration.
To put it bluntly, says Jeff, the Trump administration wanted U.S. international broadcasting to be a traditional propaganda arm, like Russia's state-funded RT channel or state media in China and other authoritarian countries. But that isn't how the founders of U.S. international broadcasting saw its role.
The International Broadcasting Act calls on the broadcasters to do journalism at the highest professional standards of Western journalism, of American journalism.
Jeff says that in all the years he worked for U.S. international broadcasting, he never witnessed any government censorship. That journalists working for the U.S. international broadcasting networks always presented a balanced perspective, regardless of who was in power.
Yes, you present the policies of the administration, but you also present responsible discussion and alternative perspectives.
When Trump took office in 2016, he hated that these U.S. government-funded networks could criticize him and that he didn't have the power to stop them. After he returned to office this year, many expected him to turn these networks into a mouthpiece for his administration. But he didn't do that. Instead, he decided to get rid of them altogether, using his senior advisor Elon Musk's federal cost-cutting efforts as a justification for defunding U.S. government-sponsored media.
It intersected with Musk's mandate to cut federal spending. And it seemed to be an easy target for that, based on the feeling that it was possible to get rid of U.S. international broadcasting without presenting any problems for the administration.
And why destroy it all? Why not do what Putin does with RT, for instance, and really turn it into a broadcasting agency that promotes whatever the policies are of the administration?
It's a mystery. It's a huge self-inflicted wound by this administration in its efforts to get its policies and its views to audiences around the world. And we're talking here more than 400 million people a week consuming U.S. international broadcasting content. Let me give you one example of what U.S. international broadcasting does that's now been lost. So, January, President Trump, newly inaugurated, goes to Capitol Hill and gives his State of the Union speech. The Voice of America carries to its global audiences that speech in full by the president.
Voice of America aired the speech with simultaneous translation into
Mandarin, Russian, Ukrainian, Farsi. These audiences around the world are getting, with no filter whatsoever, the president speaking about his priorities around the globe. That ability to reach those audiences was lost. It was there on January when he gave that speech. It is not there today.
And I'm curious what you think if, say, that U.S. international broadcasting were to survive under the Trump administration, would it have any credibility in the world? Would it be able to function the way that it had functioned?
The thing about global audiences, particularly those in countries where free media does not exist or is not fully developed, which are the target countries for U.S. international broadcasting, people understand propaganda when they hear it. They've been hearing it their whole lives. And what's been different about U.S. international broadcasting and that of other Western international broadcasters, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, NHK out of Japan, they hear multiple perspectives, and they've been hearing that for 80 years in U.S. international broadcasting. If that goes away and they're being fed just a single line, that is the administration's line, it will be filtered in the same way that people filter their own state broadcasts. They know propaganda. They've heard it before. They will understand that's what the U.S. is giving them. And I think it will not in any way be able to attract the kind of audiences that it's been able to attract for the last 80 years.
But I have to counter that a little bit. Yes, some people do know propaganda, but a lot of people believe the government propaganda, for instance, RT propaganda, and hear Fox News propaganda. People take that as gospel. So those same people might hear this new version of U.S. international broadcasting under Trump, and they might see that it's in line with what RT is saying, for instance, and to them that might seem more credible.
This has been a barrier and a challenge for U.S. international broadcasting for its entire history. There's a very high price of entry to break into these markets, to break into the consciousness of people and get them to appreciate and understand that the story is bigger and more complex than what they're getting from their favored media outlets. Frankly, this is true in the United States as well.
Viewers and listeners in today's media environment tend to be fed the same views over and over.
Trapped in algorithms and filter bubbles that only give them one perspective.
But it is possible to break through these cycles, says Jeff.
People have curiosity, potentially an open mind. They do hear and appreciate factual notes that are different from the reality that they see around them, that open up new horizons, that open up new ways of looking at things. Historically, that formula has worked.
Of course, it doesn't work for everybody, and it's never been a quick fix to U.S. foreign policy challenges. But it has been a very valuable tool.
It's been part of the long-haul soft power efforts of the United States to try to encourage the development of systems of government, of pluralistic societies that may not always agree with the United States, but with which we can have civil and normal dialogue and relations rather than constant confrontation.
And it's been a really important source of soft power that typically had bipartisan support. Is there anyone trying to save it in the Republican Party?
Up until now, there has been quiet support from some Republican members of Congress. The only public support we've heard has been from Democrats. But this also seems consistent with the reaction of members of Congress to other decisions taken by the Trump administration that we can almost be sure are not popular with those members and possibly not with many of their constituents. But there's been a reluctance and a resistance to stand up to Trump.
And what will happen if this really does go through, everything is dismantled? What will this mean for the U.S.? What will it mean for our relationship with the region of interest of the Harriman Institute?
It means that these target regions of the world for U.S. international broadcasting, the former Soviet space, Eastern Europe, Africa, much of the developing world, Asia, Cuba, it means that the United States and its policies and actions will not be defined by Western media outlets. They will be defined by the state media outlets of our adversaries.
Voice of America has 3,500 affiliate stations all over the world, in countries ranging from Romania to Nigeria, places where, for decades, U.S. government-sponsored media has had the ability to communicate the so-called Western perspective on global events, events within these countries, and domestic developments within the United States. As these stations are silenced, the void is filled by state media outlets in authoritarian countries.
So if you're looking at developments in the United States today, they're being explained to audiences in Nigeria by the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and other authoritarian states that make the investment in this kind of soft power. I don't think that's the way the United States should have itself defined. We need to define ourselves and our policies to the rest of the world and not have our story told by the likes of RT and China Global Television.
And is there anything comparable to U.S. international broadcasting, for instance? What about the BBC? Can the BBC fill that gap in any way?
The BBC can, to some extent, fill that gap. So can Deutsche Welle. The French are strong in international broadcasting.
But U.S. international broadcasting offers many more languages, says Jeff. And, as he mentioned in the beginning of this episode, the first broadcast by Voice of America wasn't even in English. It was in German.
So while the BBC has a couple of dozen language services, there are many, many fewer than U.S. international broadcasting. So there are audiences that will not be served in many languages around the world if U.S. international broadcasting disappears.
Thank you. And is there anything else our audience should know about what's happening that we haven't covered?
The world today, despite talk about the end of globalization, remains a deeply integrated space. And thanks to the digital era, it will remain so, even if there are trade barriers and other things that happen. You can't base your relationship with the rest of the world on only two tools: your military might, your economic might. By diminishing our diplomatic reach around the world, by diminishing our communications efforts around the world, by diminishing our educational opportunities and interaction with the rest of the world, we're robbing ourselves of really important tools to stay engaged with the rest of the world. And U.S. international broadcasting is an integral part of that.
And there's a big irony to the whole situation, says Jeff.
For 80 years, starting with Adolf Hitler, authoritarians around the world have tried to block, dismantle, and shut down in any way that they can U.S. international broadcasting. They've failed to do it. Instead, we've done it ourselves.
After my second conversation with Jeff, the Trump administration said Voice of America would resume broadcasting. But its programming would now incorporate the reporting of One America News, a right-wing service supportive of the president. What exactly U.S. international broadcasting will sound like under the Trump administration, and whether any of it will survive the Trump presidency, are questions still awaiting answers. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Scoop, a podcast from Harriman Magazine at Columbia University's Harriman Institute. I'm Masha Udensova-Brenner. This episode was written and produced by me and edited by Ann Cooper, with music from Blue Dot Sessions. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. Thank you. Until next time.